The first thing they did was laugh. Not loudly at first. Not enough for the judge to interrupt. Just enough to let me know they believed the ending had already been written. My husband didn't even look at me when he spoke. He faced forward, shoulders relaxed, voice smooth with the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you've already won. "She has no rights here," he said, as if stating a simple fact, as if I were a clerical error, not a person. Behind him, his mother smiled. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was satisfied. She leaned slightly toward the woman seated beside her, and the two of them exchanged a look that made my stomach tighten. The woman laughed quietly, her hand resting where mine used to be. They didn't bother lowering their voices when she whispered, "Who does she think she is?" No one stopped them. Not the bailiff, not the attorneys, not even the judge who was still organizing papers at the bench. The room accepted their certainty as if it were contagious. I stayed silent. I felt every eye in that courtroom settle on me, measuring, dismissing, deciding. To them, I looked like exactly what my husband wanted me to be that morning. Small, unprepared, already defeated. What they didn't know was that I had sent something to the judge days before the hearing, something none of them had bothered to imagine I was capable of preparing. And as they laughed, confident and careless, I understood that this was the last moment they felt safe. The courtroom itself was colder than I expected. Not physically, but emotionally. Marble floors, polished wood, the faint smell of old paper and disinfectant. My husband stood at his table with his legal team, perfectly at ease, as if this were a meeting he'd scheduled between lunch and a flight. He nodded along as his attorney spoke, occasionally offering a correction, a clarification, always calm. I sat alone on my side. One chair, one folder, one pen I hadn't picked up yet. The distance between us felt intentional, like a visual argument he didn't need words to make. From the outside, it was obvious who held the power. His side had people, confidence, momentum. Mine had silence. He glanced at me once, briefly, and then looked away. That single look carried a message he'd been delivering for months. You don't matter anymore. His mother never looked at me at all. She watched the judge instead, tracking authority, gauging control. She had always been like that, interested only in who could grant or take away what she wanted. The woman beside her mirrored the posture, the poise, the assumption that she already belonged there. She looked comfortable, like she was trying on a future that had been promised to her. I understood then that this wasn't just a divorce to them, it was a replacement. When the judge finally looked up, the room quieted. My husband straightened slightly, his confidence shifting into something performative. This was his moment to be reasonable, generous, victorious without appearing cruel. As the proceedings began, my name was spoken like an afterthought. I listened as my life was reduced to summaries and labels, dependent, non-contributing, emotional. Each word landed cleanly, efficiently, designed to sound objective, designed to make me disappear. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't. I could feel the tension ripple. Confusion, then relief on their side. Silence to them meant surrender. They didn't realize it was calculation. I had learned something important during my marriage. People who believe they control the room stop paying attention. They mistake quiet for compliance. They assume anyone who doesn't interrupt has nothing worth hearing. The judge listened carefully, her expression neutral, unreadable. She took notes. She asked a few procedural questions. Then she paused longer than expected, her fingers resting on a thin folder already open on her desk. My husband leaned back in his chair, satisfied. His mother relaxed, just slightly. The woman beside her smiled to herself as if she were already planning what came next. I recognized the folder. I remembered sealing the envelope, choosing my words carefully, resisting the urge to explain too much. I had trusted that facts, when presented clearly, didn't need decoration. I had trusted that timing mattered more than volume. The judge didn't mention it yet. She simply adjusted her glasses and looked down again, as if confirming something. The air in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. I felt it before I understood why. Still, I said nothing. That was the moment they stopped watching me completely, the moment their certainty hardened into something brittle. They thought the worst was behind them. They thought this hearing would end the way they expected, with signatures and quiet erasure. They didn't know that everything they'd built their confidence on was about to pause. Not collapse yet, not explode, just stop. And sometimes, stopping is worse. It's strange how quickly a life can be rewritten once you stop being the person holding the pen. Before I married him, I had a life that belonged to me. Not a perfect one, not a glamorous one, but it was mine. I had a career I'd built with steady effort, colleagues who respected me, friends who knew my habits and my moods. I paid my own bills. I made my own decisions. I didn't ask permission to exist. When I met my husband, he admired that about me. At least, that's what he said. He called me capable, independent, refreshing. He spoke as if my confidence were something he found attractive, not something he intended to manage. I believed him because I wanted to, because it felt good to be seen by someone who lived in a world that seemed larger and more certain than mine. Stepping into his life felt like stepping into a well-lit room. Everything was polished. The spaces he moved through were carefully curated, from the restaurants we ate in to the people he introduced me to. He was admired, respected. People listened when he spoke. I told myself that love didn't require me to shrink. I thought it would simply add to what I already was. At first, the changes were subtle, suggestions framed as care. You don't need to worry about that anymore. Let me handle it. You've been working so hard, you deserve a break. When I hesitated, he reassured me that it was temporary, that it was easier this way, that couples worked best when they trusted each other completely. I trusted him. The world I entered valued appearance more than participation. I was expected to be present, pleasant, agreeable. I learned quickly which opinions were welcome and which were better left unsaid. When I spoke out of turn, conversations stalled. When I smiled and listened, everything flowed again. I told myself this was maturity, adaptation, partnership. Slowly, without any single moment I could point to, my voice became optional. I stopped going to certain events because he said they were unnecessary. I delayed returning calls because I didn't want to seem distracted. Friends drifted away, not because anyone told me to cut them off, but because maintaining those connections required energy I no longer felt entitled to spend. He never said I couldn't see them. He simply made it inconvenient enough that I stopped trying. My work changed too, not because he demanded it, but because he questioned it. Was it fulfilling? Was it worth the stress? Did it really matter in the long run? Each question sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a quiet erosion. When I stepped back, he praised my decision, told me I was being smart, supportive, committed. I liked being praised. I didn't notice how conditional it was. There was an unspoken role I was expected to fill. I hosted. I smiled. I made things easier for him. When I did that well, the atmosphere stayed warm. When I didn't, the warmth cooled just enough to make me adjust. Approval became something I earned through compliance, not conversation. I remember one evening, standing in our living room, watching him speak with people whose names I barely knew. He spoke confidently, comfortably, as if the space itself belonged to him. I realized then that I hadn't been invited into his world so much as positioned within it. I was an accessory, not a partner. The isolation didn't feel like isolation at the time. It felt like focus, like growth, like a narrowing of priorities that adults are supposed to accept. I told myself that marriages evolve, that independence looks different when you're building something together. What I didn't see was how easily I accepted less space for myself. His family reinforced it without saying it directly. Conversations that flowed around me, decisions announced, not discussed. I was included, but only as long as I didn't complicate things. When I asked questions, they were answered patiently, as if indulging a misunderstanding rather than engaging an equal. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to wait before responding, to choose my words carefully. Silence became a habit, then a skill. Looking back, I can see how carefully the boundaries were drawn. Not harshly, not dramatically. just firmly enough that crossing them felt like bad manners rather than resistance. I wasn't told who to be. I was shown over and over what was acceptable. By the time I noticed how much I'd changed, I told myself it was normal, that everyone compromises, that love requires adjustment. I didn't recognize the difference between adaptation and erasure. I believed that staying quiet kept things stable, that endurance was a kind of strength, that if I just did my part, everything would remain intact. I didn't realize that stability built on silence only works for the people who benefit from it. There were moments even then when something felt off. A look exchanged over my shoulder, a comment that lingered longer than it should have, a sense that my place was being evaluated, not assumed. I brushed it aside, convinced that loyalty would protect me. I was wrong. By the time I understood that my role in that family was conditional, the conditions had already changed, and I was no longer the person they were planning around. I was never meant to stay. I didn't understand that at first. I thought the tension with his mother was ordinary, the kind of friction people joke about. She was particular, traditional, protective of her son. I told myself it was natural. I tried to earn her approval the way I'd learned to earn everything else in that family, by being useful, agreeable, invisible when necessary. It never worked. From the beginning, she watched me the way people watch something they're not sure belongs. Her questions were polite but probing. Where did I come from? What did my parents do? How long did I plan to keep working? Each answer seemed to be weighed against a standard I had never been told about and could never meet. She didn't criticize me directly. That would have required acknowledging me as an equal. Instead, she spoke about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right there. "She's different," she would say with a tight smile. "Not what we're used to." Different wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. I tried harder. I adapted my tone, my clothes, my presence. I learned when to arrive and when to excuse myself. I memorized preferences. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I told myself that acceptance takes time. What I didn't see was that she wasn't waiting for me to fit in. She was waiting for me to fail. The first time I noticed her watching another woman the way she had once watched me, I told myself I was imagining it. The woman appeared at a family event, introduced casually, as if she had always belonged. She was polished, confident, effortlessly aligned with the expectations I had spent years trying to decipher. My mother-in-law lit up in her presence. She leaned toward her, laughed more freely, asked questions that assumed familiarity. It was subtle, but unmistakable. This woman didn't have to prove herself. She was already approved. I caught my husband's eye across the room, expecting discomfort, denial, something. Instead, he looked away. That was the first crack. After that, things began to align too neatly to ignore. Invitations I wasn't included in. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Compliments that weren't meant for me but were delivered in front of me, like demonstrations. "She understands how things work," his mother said once, smiling at the woman. "Some people just get it." I was standing right there. I realized then that what I had mistaken for tension was strategy. This wasn't about personality clashes or generational differences. It was about replacement, about control, about ensuring that her son's life reflected her standards, her image, her influence. She had never intended to adjust to me. She intended to remove me. The woman's presence became more frequent, more normalized. She knew family stories I'd never been told. She referenced plans I hadn't heard about. When I asked questions, answers were vague, dismissive. "Oh, it's nothing," they'd say. "Don't worry about it." I worried anyway. My husband changed too. He became distant, preoccupied, irritated by questions he once tolerated. When I tried to talk to him, he accused me of being paranoid, sensitive, insecure. He framed my discomfort as a personal flaw, not a response to reality. "You're imagining things," he said more than once. "You're overthinking it." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be the problem, because problems can be fixed. What I didn't want to face was the possibility that the people I had rearranged my life for had already decided my role was temporary. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. His mother's voice carried easily through the house, sharp with certainty. "She's not right for him," she said. "You know that. She never was." There was a pause, then softer laughter. "This is better. This makes sense." I stood frozen, my hand on the doorframe, my body heavy with a truth I could no longer ignore. They weren't hiding it because they didn't think they needed to. From that moment on, I stopped trying to win her over. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Not because I suddenly felt strong, but because I finally understood the rules of the game I'd been playing without realizing it. There was no version of me that would be enough. The realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. It stripped away the illusion that effort could change outcome, that loyalty could protect me, that silence could preserve my place. I watched carefully after that. I noticed how my husband deferred to his mother without question, how decisions were discussed with her first, then presented to me as conclusions, how the woman was treated not as a guest, but as a future. I began to see how coordinated it all was, how long it must have been unfolding, how naive I'd been to think love alone determined who stayed. What frightened me most wasn't the thought of losing my marriage. It was the realization that I had been living inside someone else's plan, unaware of how close I was to being erased entirely. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. Instead, I started paying attention, and that, I would learn, was far more dangerous than anger. The signs were small at first, almost polite in the way they tried not to be noticed. A scent on his jacket that didn't belong to me. Not strong, not obvious, just unfamiliar enough to make me pause before hanging it in the closet. I told myself it was from a meeting, a hotel lobby, some forgettable interaction. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who searched for meaning in fabric. Then there were the changes in routine. Dinners that ran late without explanation. Trips that appeared on the calendar after they had already begun. Calls taken in another room, his voice lowered, his answers clipped. Each instance on its own meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I tried not to trace. I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. I needed to understand what I was seeing before I named it. Accusations invite denial. Denial buries truth deeper. I wasn't ready to lose what little clarity I still had. One evening, I found a receipt folded carelessly in his pocket. An expensive restaurant, one I had mentioned wanting to try months earlier. The date matched a night he had told me he was working late. I stared at the paper longer than necessary, feeling something inside me settle. Not break, settle. The truth has weight. Once you feel it, pretending becomes exhausting. I began to notice details I had trained myself to overlook. How he angled his phone away from me. How his smile appeared at messages that weren't meant for my eyes. How his irritation surfaced when I asked simple questions. Not angry, just inconvenienced, as if my presence interrupted a more important narrative. The night I saw them together, there was no drama to announce it. No cinematic timing. Just coincidence and clarity. I had gone to a place we used to visit when we first married, a quiet restaurant where no one tried too hard. I told myself it was nostalgia, a desire to remember something before it disappeared completely. I wasn't looking for him. That's what I told myself, and it was almost true. They were seated by the window. He leaned toward her the way he used to lean toward me, his body angled in attention, his expression unguarded. She laughed freely, touching his arm without hesitation. They looked comfortable, familiar, like people who didn't expect to be interrupted. I didn't freeze. I didn't cry. I stood there long enough to understand what I was seeing, then I turned around and left. I walked out into the street and kept walking until my legs reminded me I was still in my body. That was the moment everything shifted. I could have confronted him then. I could have demanded explanations, apologies, promises. I could have made a scene that would have satisfied the part of me that wanted him to feel exposed. But something else took over, something quieter, more deliberate. I chose not to react. Silence, when it's chosen, is not weakness, it's distance, and distance creates space to see clearly. From that point on, I watched instead of spoke. I listened instead of asked. I let him believe his performance was convincing. People are careless when they think they've succeeded. They repeat patterns. They make mistakes. They underestimate how much they reveal when they're no longer cautious. I began keeping records, dates, times, messages left open too long, phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I didn't invade his privacy. I didn't need to. He was already leaving pieces of himself behind. There were credit card charges that didn't align with our routine, hotels I'd never been to, purchases that didn't come home. I made copies, screenshots, notes written in a notebook I kept hidden among old paperwork no one ever touched. At night, while he slept beside me, unaware, I lay awake replaying conversations with new understanding. Moments that had once confused me now made sense, his impatience, his deflection, his growing certainty that I would stay quiet. I let him keep believing that. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the discipline required not to reveal that I knew. Every instinct pushed me toward confrontation, toward forcing the truth into the open. But I understood now that truth, once exposed too early, can be dismissed, ridiculed, turned back on the person who dares to speak it. So I didn't speak. I began to understand my mother-in-law's role more clearly, too. The way she facilitated introductions, the way she spoke about the woman as if she were inevitable. This wasn't a secret affair that had gotten out of hand. It was an arrangement that had been normalized long before I was meant to notice. That realization hurt more deeply than I expected, not because I had wanted her approval, but because I had believed my place was secure. I had believed that commitment meant something. It did, just not to them. Each day, my silence grew heavier, but also steadier. It wasn't passive. It was intentional. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was preparing. There is a difference between being unaware and being observant. I crossed that line quietly without announcement. And once I did, there was no going back to who I had been. They thought I was shrinking. What I was actually doing was collecting the truth, piece by piece, and learning how to carry it without letting it show. I didn't go looking for the truth. It found me because the people hiding it grew careless. By then, secrecy had become routine in our house. Doors closed more often, files locked without explanation. Conversations paused when I entered a room. I learned to move quietly, not out of fear, but out of habit. When you live beside someone who believes you're invisible, you see more than they intend. The first thing I found wasn't dramatic. It was a folder, misfiled, tucked between documents I'd been asked to organize months earlier. He had trusted me with small tasks, the kind that made him feel generous without risking anything important. This time, he forgot what he'd handed me. Inside were statements that didn't match the accounts I knew, numbers that didn't align with the life we lived, transfers routed through names I didn't recognize, companies I'd never heard of. At first, I assumed there was a reasonable explanation. There always had been before. But the more I looked, the less reasonable it seemed. I told myself to stop. Curiosity can be dangerous when it's driven by hurt. But this wasn't curiosity anymore. It was concern, for myself, for my future, for what I might be standing next to without understanding it. I didn't confront him. I copied the files and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. The next day I accessed the shared computer he rarely logged out of. He trusted routine more than security. That was his mistake. What I saw there confirmed what the papers had suggested. Accounts layered beneath accounts. Assets moved just before reporting deadlines. Properties registered under third parties with connections that were thin at best. This wasn't creative accounting. It was concealment. My hands shook as I worked. Not with fear, but with the effort of staying steady. I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't looking for proof of anything beyond betrayal. Yet here I was, staring at a structure built to hide far more than an affair. I remembered the way he spoke about money, about control, about never letting anyone have leverage over him. I understood now that it wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. The realization changed everything. The affair, as devastating as it was, suddenly felt like a distraction. A layer meant to occupy my attention while something far more dangerous existed beneath the surface. I wondered how long his mother had known. I wondered whether the woman had been chosen only for convenience, or if she knew more than she let on. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of what staying ignorant would cost me. Knowledge has consequences. Once you possess it, neutrality is no longer an option. I needed to be careful. Careful about what I touched, what I copied, what I remembered. This wasn't something I could handle emotionally or legally on my own. I needed guidance without exposing myself. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague who had moved into a field adjacent enough to understand what I was seeing without being directly involved. I framed it as a hypothetical. I asked questions without names. I listened more than I spoke. Her response was quiet, measured, and unmistakably serious. If what I suspected was accurate, this wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Hearing it said out loud, even cautiously, grounded me in a way nothing else had. This wasn't paranoia, this wasn't bitterness, this was real, and it had weight. She told me to protect myself first, to document everything, to avoid confrontation, to understand that people who build systems like this don't panic easily, but they retaliate when threatened. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I needed to decide what role I was willing to play and what came next. For days, I moved through the house as if nothing had changed. I smiled when expected. I nodded when spoken to. I absorbed his confidence, his certainty, his complete belief that I remained unaware. There is a strange clarity that comes from knowing you are underestimated. It sharpens your focus. It removes doubt. I began to assemble what I had found into something coherent. Not just files, but context. Timelines. Connections. I didn't speculate. I recorded. Facts only. I treated my own emotions like liabilities, something to be set aside until they could no longer interfere. The more I gathered, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't recent. It hadn't begun with the affair or the tension at home. It had been unfolding for years, protected by complexity and the assumption that no one close enough to notice would ever look closely. He had been right about one thing. I hadn't looked closely before. What haunted me most wasn't the scale of it. It was how easily he had lived with it, how casually he had slept beside me while building something that could destroy us both if it came to light, how comfortable he was assuming I would never be more than background. That assumption became my shield. I didn't feel powerful then. I felt responsible. Responsible for my own survival. Responsible for choosing the right moment to act. There is a difference between revenge and exposure. One is emotional. The other is structural. I chose structure. By the time I finished organizing everything I had found, I knew one thing for certain. Leaving quietly wasn't an option anymore. Pretending ignorance would not protect me, and confronting him directly would only alert him to what he needed to erase. If this truth was going to matter, it needed to surface where it couldn't be dismissed or buried. I closed the folder and returned it to its place. He never noticed. And in that silence, a new understanding settled over me. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. I was a witness. And witnesses, once they understand what they're holding, must decide when to speak. By the time I decided to stay quiet on purpose, I understood exactly how dangerous silence could be if it wasn't controlled. During the day, I became what they expected me to be: calm, agreeable, predictable. I moved through the house without friction, responded to questions without curiosity, and offered no resistance that might invite scrutiny. My husband relaxed into the version of me he believed he had already defeated. He stopped watching his words. He stopped guarding his routines. At night, everything changed. When the house went quiet and his confidence turned into sleep, I worked. Not recklessly, not obsessively, but methodically. I copied files and returned them to their places. I documented patterns instead of reacting to moments. I wrote notes by hand first, then transferred them to secure storage he had no reason to access. I learned how to make my movements invisible by making them boring. I wasn't pretending anymore, I was performing. What surprised me was how easy it became. Once fear is replaced by purpose, your body stops hesitating. I stopped second-guessing myself. I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. I trusted what I could verify and ignored everything else. I learned the rhythm of his life. When he checked accounts, when he made calls, when he traveled. I learned which weeks mattered more than others and which days were safest to observe without leaving a trace. He believed control came from dominance. In reality, it came from patterns. His mother continued to play her role perfectly. She spoke to me with surface politeness, occasionally offering advice framed as concern. She never suspected I had stepped outside the script she'd written for me. She still believed I was managing my disappointment quietly, nursing my humiliation in private. The woman remained present too, increasingly confident, increasingly careless. She spoke freely when she thought I wasn't listening. She left evidence behind without realizing it. She assumed proximity meant protection. That assumption would cost her later, though she didn't know it yet. I didn't collect information out of anger. I collected it because I needed leverage to survive what was coming. I had seen enough to understand that when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just affect my marriage. It would destabilize the foundation they were standing on. That made timing everything. I reached out again, this time more deliberately, not to friends, not to family, to people who understood systems, processes, consequences. I asked what protection looked like when exposure was inevitable. I asked how to remain anonymous until anonymity was no longer possible. The answers were clear and unsettling. If I spoke too soon, the truth could be minimized, framed as bitterness or retaliation. If I spoke too late, evidence could disappear. There was a narrow window where facts would matter more than narratives. That window aligned with the divorce. The realization felt cold and precise. The hearing they were so confident about, the moment they believed would finalize my erasure, was exactly where they would be least prepared for scrutiny. They would be focused on division, not investigation, on victory, not defense. I suggested the timing carefully, without revealing myself fully. I was instructed on how to submit information discreetly, how to let it exist in the system without attaching my voice to it yet. I followed those instructions exactly. From that point on, I lived two lives. In one, I packed boxes slowly, discussed settlements I had no intention of accepting, and listened while my husband spoke about fairness with a straight face. In the other, I prepared for a shift that would leave no room for his confidence. There were moments when the weight of it pressed down on me, when I wanted to scream, to accuse, to demand acknowledgement. But emotion is loud, and loud things attract attention. I couldn't afford attention yet. I reminded myself that I wasn't hiding out of fear, I was waiting out of strategy. The night I sent the final packet, I didn't feel relief. I felt resolve. I sealed the envelope with steady hands, double-checked the documentation, and let it go. Once it left my possession, it would follow rules neither my husband nor his mother controlled. I slept deeply that night for the first time in months. After that, my role was simple. I had to be exactly what they expected until the moment they couldn't ignore me anymore. I didn't argue during mediation. I didn't object to their assumptions. I let them believe I had nothing left to defend. People who think they've already won stop preparing for loss. I watched as their confidence hardened into certainty, as plans were made without accounting for resistance, as my silence was interpreted as surrender. They never considered that silence could be alignment rather than absence. By the time the hearing date arrived, I had done everything I needed to do. The evidence existed. The mechanisms were in place. The truth was no longer fragile. All that remained was the moment when they would realize the ground beneath them was no longer solid. And I would still be sitting there quiet, exactly where they left me. They walked into the courtroom like people arriving at a celebration planned in their honor. My husband smiled easily, shaking hands with his attorney, nodding to acquaintances as if this were a formality rather than an ending. He wore confidence the way he wore his tailored suit, without effort, without doubt. His mother followed close behind, composed and alert, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who believed she understood power better than anyone else present. The woman took her seat beside them without hesitation, her posture relaxed, her expression expectant. They didn't look at me. That, more than anything else, told me how certain they were. The judge entered and everyone rose. As we sat, I felt the familiar calm settle over me, the kind that comes not from hope, but from preparation. I folded my hands, my single folder resting on the table in front of me. Across the aisle, their side looked abundant, stacks of documents, advisors leaning in to whisper, momentum made visible. Proceedings began smoothly. My husband's attorney spoke first, outlining a narrative they had rehearsed for weeks. He described a marriage that had outlived its usefulness, a wife who had stepped away from her career by choice, a man who had provided generously and asked only for fairness in return. My husband nodded at the appropriate moments, occasionally adding a comment, always measured, always reasonable. He spoke of responsibility, of stability, of his desire to move forward without unnecessary conflict. He didn't mention betrayal. He didn't mention secrecy. He certainly didn't mention the truth. When my mother-in-law was invited to speak, she did so confidently, her voice steady, her words carefully chosen. She spoke of concern, of emotional instability, of how hard the situation had been on her son. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. The woman didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence was its own argument. She sat comfortably as if her future had already been negotiated. She smiled when appropriate, nodded in agreement, and never once appeared uncertain. I listened to all of it without interruption. When it was my turn, the judge looked at me expectantly. I felt the room lean in, anticipating emotion, defensiveness, perhaps desperation. I gave them none of it. I answered questions simply, directly, without embellishment. I did not explain myself beyond what was asked. My restraint unsettled them. My husband glanced at his attorney, confused by my composure. He had expected anger or collapse. Silence, when it doesn't look like fear, is disruptive. The judge asked a few clarifying questions about finances. My husband responded confidently, as if the numbers were solid ground beneath his feet. His attorney supported him smoothly, reinforcing the impression of transparency. They spoke with the ease of people who believed scrutiny would end here. It didn't. At one point, the judge paused longer than expected. She flipped through her notes, then reached for a separate folder already open on her desk. I recognized it immediately, though I didn't react. The shift in the room was subtle, but unmistakable. Conversation stopped. Movement slowed. My husband leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing confidence. The judge adjusted her glasses and asked a question that hadn't been on the schedule. A question about timing, about transfers, about entities not listed in the disclosures provided. The room held its breath. My husband answered quickly, too quickly, his voice steady but his eyes searching his attorney's face. The answer was plausible, rehearsed even, but it landed differently now. The judge asked another question, then another. His attorney intervened, suggesting clarification at a later date. The judge didn't disagree. She simply took notes. My mother-in-law's posture stiffened, her hands folded tighter in her lap. She was watching the judge now, not me. The woman shifted in her seat for the first time. I remained still. As the hearing progressed, the confidence on their side began to thin. Not dramatically, not visibly enough to alarm anyone unfamiliar with power dynamics. But I saw it. The careful recalibration. The awareness that something had entered the room that hadn't been accounted for. Near the end, the judge paused again, longer this time. She looked down at the folder once more, then up at the room. "I'm going to suspend proceedings," she said calmly. The words didn't register immediately. My husband blinked. His attorney straightened. My mother-in-law's expression froze, caught between control and confusion. The woman's smile faltered. The judge explained that additional review was required, that certain information needed to be examined before any decisions could be finalized, that this was not a delay born of inconvenience but of responsibility. No one spoke. The gavel came down, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. As people began to rise, confusion rippled outward. Questions formed but weren't asked. My husband stood slowly, his confidence now brittle, his movements cautious. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time in months. I met his gaze without expression. I gathered my folder and stood, feeling none of the triumph he must have imagined I'd crave. This wasn't victory, it was gravity. The moment when certainty realizes it has miscalculated. As I walked toward the exit, I passed close enough to hear my mother-in-law whisper something sharp and urgent. I didn't slow down to listen. They had believed the hearing would end with signatures and silence. They had believed they would leave with closure and control. Instead, they left with questions. And for the first time since all of this began, they were no longer sure how the story would end. The fallout didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, the way consequences often do when no one is watching for them. In the days after the suspended hearing, everything slowed. Phone calls went unanswered longer than usual. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Advisors who had once spoken confidently now asked careful questions, their voices measured, their language suddenly precise. Nothing had been decided yet, and that uncertainty unsettled them far more than a verdict would have. I felt it immediately, even without updates. When systems shift, they don't announce themselves, they tighten. My husband stopped calling as often. When he did, his tone was different. Still controlled but alert, as if every word needed to be weighed. He no longer spoke about outcomes. He spoke about process, about patience, about misunderstandings that would surely be clarified. He wasn't reassuring me, he was reassuring himself. From a distance, I watched the armor fall away. The easy confidence he once carried had been replaced with vigilance. Conversations were no longer casual. Smiles appeared late and disappeared quickly. He listened more than he spoke, a reversal so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed it. I noticed everything. His mother retreated into silence. The woman who had once orchestrated every interaction, every introduction, every narrative, was suddenly absent. No calls, no appearances, no commentary. It wasn't strength, it was containment. The kind of silence people adopt when they know visibility no longer serves them. Control depends on certainty. Without it, even the most practiced strategist loses her footing. The woman who thought she had inherited my place felt the shift too. Her presence diminished. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations that once included her now happened without her. The future she had been promised grew vague, then invisible. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it unravel. I felt clarity. This was never about replacing me. It was about maintaining a structure that required someone expendable. When that structure cracked, everyone standing on it became unstable. For me, the change was immediate and profound. I moved through my days without bracing myself. Decisions no longer felt like negotiations. I hired my own counsel, reviewed my own finances, and made plans without explaining them to anyone. Independence returned quietly, without fanfare, but it stayed. I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating reactions that no longer mattered. There were moments when the weight of it all surfaced unexpectedly. Standing in line somewhere ordinary, hearing a song I hadn't listened to in years. I would pause, feel the echo of who I had been, then continue forward without needing to look back. The truth had done its work. Not loudly, not cruelly, just thoroughly. I thought about the word revenge often, how people imagine it. Explosive, emotional, vindictive. What I had experienced was none of those things. This wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about removing protection from lies that had relied on my silence to survive. I hadn't destroyed them. I had stopped covering for them. That distinction mattered. The legal process continued in its own time, methodical and unhurried. Assets were reviewed, timelines examined, questions asked that couldn't be brushed aside. I didn't need to attend every meeting. I didn't need to insist on outcomes. The machinery of accountability had been set in motion, and it didn't require my presence to function. For the first time in years, I trusted something beyond myself. One afternoon, weeks after the hearing, I sat alone in a quiet room, reviewing paperwork that represented my life going forward. Not what I had lost, but what I had reclaimed. There was no rush, no fear, just choices. That was when I understood the true shift. Power hadn't returned to me in the courtroom. It had returned the moment I stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me, the moment I let facts speak where emotion once begged for recognition. They had laughed because they thought I was alone, because they believed silence meant submission, because they had mistaken my restraint for absence. They were wrong. The fallout didn't need spectacle. It needed time. And time, once aligned with truth, is unforgiving. As I closed the folder and stood to leave, I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not triumph. Stability. Whatever happened next would happen on ground that no longer belonged to them. And for the first time since I walked into that courtroom, I knew with certainty that I wasn't waiting anymore. I was standing exactly where I needed to be. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, each one peeling back quietly, leaving no place for certainty to hide. The divorce proceedings remained suspended, but nothing else stood still. Accounts were flagged, transfers delayed, requests for clarification multiplied. The kind of questions that don't accuse, but don't let go either. My husband tried to frame it as a temporary inconvenience, a procedural pause that would be resolved with the right explanations. He said it often enough that he almost believed it. Almost. What changed first was the way people spoke to him. Not openly, not dramatically, but cautiously. Conversations that used to end with assurances now ended with conditions. Advisors stopped predicting outcomes and started listing risks. The word exposure began to appear where confidence used to live. He stopped pretending I didn't exist. His calls came late, his messages carefully worded. He asked how I was doing, as if concern could be retroactive. I responded politely, briefly, without offering anything he could use. He wanted to measure me, to see if I was angry or desperate. I gave him neither. At night, I thought about the strange symmetry of it all. How my silence had once been used against me, and how now it created space he couldn't control. When someone relies on your reactions to orient themselves, the absence of reaction becomes disorienting. His mother tried to intervene in the only way she knew how. She reached out indirectly, through family acquaintances, shared contacts, people who believed they were offering neutral advice. The messages carried the same tone she had always favored: concern masked as reason, appeals to harmony, reminders of reputation. I declined every invitation to engage. The woman faded from view entirely. Her social presence vanished, her name no longer mentioned. She had been useful when the story was simple. Now she complicated it. In times of uncertainty, people shed complications first. I didn't feel vindicated watching it happen. I felt detached, like someone observing the collapse of a structure they once lived inside, grateful to be standing somewhere else when it finally gave way. The investigation widened without announcement. Not because of me, but because truth has a way of connecting dots once it's allowed to exist. Questions led to other questions. Names led to other names. What had been hidden behind complexity began to look deliberate. My husband tried to regain control by accelerating the divorce, by pushing for quick resolutions that would limit scrutiny. It didn't work. Momentum had shifted, and momentum answers to no one's schedule. One afternoon, I received confirmation that assets were being reviewed independently. Not as part of our separation, but as part of something larger, something that no longer centered on me. That was when I understood how completely the narrative had changed. I was no longer the problem to be managed. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for. The legal language was dry, procedural, almost boring, but beneath it ran a current that felt unmistakable. This wasn't going away, not quietly, not quickly. Whatever happened next would unfold in rooms I would never enter, through conversations I would never hear. That was the point. I focused on my own life with an attention I hadn't allowed myself before. Practical things, work, housing, plans that didn't include contingency clauses built around someone else's behavior. Each decision reinforced a simple truth: my future no longer depended on his stability. There were moments when fear surfaced unexpectedly, not of him, but of the scale of what I had stepped into. I reminded myself that I hadn't created any of it. I had only stopped pretending it wasn't there. When the first formal notice arrived, he didn't tell me right away. I learned about it through my own channels, through updates that were factual and restrained. The investigation had moved beyond preliminary review. Language shifted. Stakes sharpened. He came to see me days later. He didn't apologize. He didn't accuse. He asked questions, indirect ones, about what I knew, about who I'd spoken to, about what I wanted. The man who once dismissed me now searched my face for leverage. I gave him none. I told him I wanted the truth to be handled properly, that I wanted resolution, that I wanted to move forward. All of it was true. None of it reassured him. When he left, I felt the finality settle. Not because I had said anything decisive, but because I hadn't needed to. The process no longer required my participation to continue. The cascade followed quickly after that. Financial restrictions, formal inquiries, the careful distancing of people who once benefited from proximity. Alliances fracture fastest when risk enters the equation. I watched it all from a distance, no longer bracing for impact, no longer calculating how to survive the next conversation. I had already survived the worst part, the part where I believed my silence made me powerless. It hadn't. Power, I realized, isn't about winning arguments or humiliating opponents. It's about refusing to carry other people's lies once you recognize them for what they are. It's about stepping aside and letting accountability do its work. By the time the dominoes began to fall in earnest, I was no longer standing near them. I was already moving on. Weeks passed, and with them went the illusion that this would resolve itself quietly. The suspension of the hearing had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured attention my husband had never anticipated. Requests arrived without urgency, but with persistence. Documents he had once treated as formalities were now examined line by line. Meetings were postponed, then rescheduled, then postponed again. No one explained why. No one needed to. I didn't receive updates directly. I didn't ask for them. Silence in this phase spoke clearly enough. When systems begin to turn, they don't announce themselves. They simply stop accommodating shortcuts. I noticed the shift most clearly in the way people avoided certainty. Lawyers stopped saying when and started saying if. Advisors stopped offering reassurance and began outlining contingencies. Conversations that once ended with confidence now ended with careful pauses. My husband felt it before he admitted it. When we spoke, his voice carried a new restraint. He chose his words as if they might be quoted later. He no longer spoke in conclusions. He spoke in possibilities, misunderstandings, context, temporary complications that would, of course, be clarified. He wasn't convincing me. He was trying to convince himself that control hadn't slipped beyond reach. I saw him once, unexpectedly, weeks after the hearing. He looked different. Not older exactly, but alert in a way that suggested sleep no longer came easily. The ease that once defined him had been replaced by vigilance. His eyes moved more. His posture held tension. Power doesn't vanish overnight, it thins. His mother disappeared almost entirely. The woman who had once directed every narrative, every perception, now remained out of sight. No calls, no public appearances, no subtle interventions. It wasn't dignity, it was containment. The kind of silence adopted by people who know visibility has become a liability. Her influence had always relied on certainty. Without it, even her authority had limits. The woman who thought she had secured my place fared worse. She was gradually excluded from conversations that mattered. Invitations stopped. Plans became undefined. She lingered on the edges of a future that no longer needed her. Replacement, I realized, only works when the structure remains intact. Once it cracks, everyone scrambles for footing. For me, the weeks unfolded differently. I met with my own counsel, reviewed finances I hadn't been allowed to touch in years, made decisions without seeking permission or approval. Independence didn't arrive dramatically. It returned quietly, through small, steady choices that added up to something solid. I noticed how much lighter my days felt without the constant calculation of someone else's reactions. There were moments when memory intruded unexpectedly, a phrase he used to say, a place we used to go. I would pause, acknowledge the feeling, then move on without needing to resolve it. The past had lost its grip. It no longer dictated the present. I thought often about the difference between revenge and consequence. Revenge requires intent to harm. Consequence requires only truth and time. What was unfolding now wasn't driven by my anger. It was driven by the removal of protection. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had stopped holding it together. That distinction mattered more than I expected. The process continued methodically. Assets were reviewed independently. Questions expanded beyond the scope of our marriage. What had once been a personal betrayal became part of a broader examination. I was no longer at the center of it, and that was exactly where I wanted to be. One afternoon, I sat alone with paperwork spread across a table, reviewing plans for my own future. There was no urgency, no fear of missteps. I realized how long it had been since I'd felt this grounded. Stability, I understood, isn't about certainty, it's about agency. Power hadn't returned to me when the judge suspended the hearing. It had returned the moment I stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. The moment I let fact speak where emotion had once begged for recognition. They had laughed because they believed I was defenseless, because they mistook silence for submission, because they assumed restraint meant absence. They were wrong. The weeks after the hearing revealed something else, too. People who rely on dominance struggle deeply with accountability. They don't know how to exist without an audience that affirms them. When that affirmation disappears, they unravel quietly, internally, long before anything becomes public. I watched it happen without satisfaction or bitterness, just observation. As I closed the folder in front of me and stood to leave, I felt something settle that had nothing to do with victory. It was a recognition, a certainty that whatever happened next would unfold on ground that no longer belonged to them. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the outcome. I was already standing in it. Months later, the noise had faded enough for me to hear myself think. The legal tension that once followed me everywhere no longer filled the air. Days unfolded without the constant anticipation of the next call, the next message, the next demand for explanation. I woke up without rehearsing conversations in my head. I went to sleep without bracing for impact. Life had slowed into something intentional, and for the first time in a long while, that felt safe. I noticed the change in my voice before I noticed it anywhere else. I spoke without pre-planning every sentence. I answered questions without measuring how my response might be used against me. When I disagreed, I did so calmly, without apology or justification. There was a quiet confidence in that, not the loud kind that needs to be asserted, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you no longer need permission. I had forgotten what that felt like. Rebuilding my life didn't happen all at once. It happened in ordinary decisions. Choosing work that felt meaningful instead of strategic. Managing my finances without oversight or judgment. Creating routines that reflected who I was now, not who I had been expected to be. Independence stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like ownership. I spent time alone without rushing to fill the silence. In that space, I began to recognize how deeply I had been conditioned to minimize myself. How often I had softened opinions, deferred decisions, or stayed quiet simply to keep the peace. The absence of that pressure revealed how much of my energy had been spent maintaining a version of myself that made others comfortable. I didn't miss it. Family, I learned, is not defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by safety, by respect that doesn't need to be negotiated, by relationships that don't require you to disappear in order to belong. Letting go of the family I had tried so hard to fit into was painful, but it was also freeing. I stopped asking why they couldn't see me and started accepting that they never intended to. Their approval had always been conditional, and I had finally stepped outside those conditions. Forgiveness came quietly without ceremony. Not forgiveness that forgets or excuses, but forgiveness that releases. I stopped replaying arguments in my head. I stopped imagining what I would say if given one more chance to explain myself. Closure didn't come from apologies or acknowledgement. It came from truth standing on its own, no longer requiring my defense. I could see my past self more clearly then. The woman who stayed silent. who endured, who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. For a long time I had judged her harshly. I saw her as weak, naive, complicit in her own erasure. But with distance came compassion. She wasn't weak, she was surviving with the tools she had. She did the best she could in a system designed to benefit from her restraint. She adapted because adaptation felt safer than resistance, and when adaptation was no longer enough, she learned something new. I felt grateful to her. Without her endurance, I wouldn't have made it to the moment where endurance was no longer required. Power, I realized, had been misunderstood for most of my life. I had associated it with control, with authority, with the ability to dominate a room. That was the version I had been surrounded by, the version that had once intimidated me. But real power looks different. It looks like choice, like boundaries that don't need to be announced, like peace that isn't dependent on anyone else's behavior. It doesn't raise its voice or demand recognition. It simply exists, unmoved. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone who had already decided not to listen. There were days when reminders of the past surfaced unexpectedly. A familiar street, a phrase overheard in passing. Instead of tightening, I let the feeling move through me and pass. It no longer owned me. It informed me, then released me. I began to look forward again. Not with grand plans or dramatic declarations, but with curiosity. What did I want now that my life was my own? Who did I want to be when no one was watching? Those questions felt open instead of urgent, inviting rather than demanding. The answers didn't arrive immediately, and that was fine. As I moved through my days, I carried a quiet certainty with me. I had faced something designed to break me and emerged intact, not hardened, not closed off, but clearer. More precise about what I would and would not allow. I no longer measured my worth by what I survived. I measured it by what I chose next. And in that space, free from noise and expectation, I understood that the story I had lived was no longer about them. It was about me becoming someone who could not be erased again. Whatever came next would be built on that foundation. I still remember the sound of their laughter in that courtroom, but it no longer lives in my body the way it used to. At the time, it felt sharp and personal, like something meant to reduce me to a cautionary tale. Now it feels distant, almost educational. Not because it didn't matter, but because it taught me something I had spent years avoiding. That moment didn't define my ending. It exposed the truth of what I had been standing inside all along. What actually ended that day wasn't my marriage. It wasn't even the legal proceedings. What ended was their certainty, their belief that they could decide who I was and where I belonged without consequence. They thought the hearing would close a chapter quietly, with signatures and assumptions intact. Instead, it opened something they couldn't control. I didn't win because I outplayed them in public. I won because I stopped protecting their version of reality. For a long time, I believed justice had to be loud to be real. That it required confrontation, raised voices, visible triumph. I thought silence meant weakness because that's what I had been taught. But I learned something different. Real justice doesn't announce itself. It arrives when lies lose their shelter and truth is allowed to stand on its own. Silence is only dangerous when it's forced. When it's chosen, it becomes strategy. They underestimated me because it benefited them to do so. People in power often mistake restraint for incapacity. They assume anyone who doesn't interrupt must have nothing to say. That assumption gives them comfort. It also makes them careless. Their laughter gave me time to see clearly, time to prepare, time to step aside and let accountability do what it does best when no one interferes. I've thought a lot about being underestimated since then, about how often it happens in families, in marriages, at work, how often women are told directly or indirectly that staying quiet is the price of belonging, that endurance is the same thing as strength, that if you don't fight back loudly, you must not be fighting at all. That simply isn't true. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel familiar, I want you to know something. Silence doesn't erase your power. It only hides it from people who are invested in not seeing it. Endurance isn't surrender, and choosing your moment doesn't mean you've missed your chance. For me, the most important lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Recognizing when explanation is wasted. Recognizing when your energy is better spent preparing instead of pleading. Recognizing that you don't owe clarity to people committed to misunderstanding you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't seek punishment. I simply stopped carrying their secrets and allowed the truth to exist where it mattered. That was enough. Today, my life is quieter. Not smaller, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes from stability, not suppression. I make decisions without rehearsing defenses. I move forward without looking over my shoulder. The past no longer asks for my attention, and when it does, I acknowledge it without letting it lead. I don't measure myself by what I endured anymore. I measure myself by what I allow now. And when I think back to that courtroom, to the smirks and whispers and certainty that filled the room, I don't feel anger. I feel something closer to understanding. They laughed because they believed the story was over. They laughed because they thought I had nothing left. They were wrong. That was the last time anyone laughed at me before I spoke. If this story resonated with you, I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated like you didn't matter? Did you ever get the chance to respond, or are you still waiting for the right moment? Share your thoughts in the comments if it feels right. You're not alone here. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet strength, real justice, and the moments when the tables finally turn, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this space. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that don't need to shout. Thank you for listening. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.